Hey, thanks for stopping by. My name's Thomas, and this is Zarbo Audio Projects. In this video, I'm going to show you two different ways of putting a finish on a speaker enclosure, or in this case, a subwoofer enclosure. This is the third and final video in my three-part series on this project. So check out the other two videos if you haven't already seen those. I'll leave links in the video description below. At the end of the last video, I had applied veneer to both cabinets, made all the cutouts, drilled all the holes, and had sanded them down to about 220 grit or so. At that point, they were ready to have a finish applied, and that's where we'll start from in this video. This light colored cabinet is white birch veneer, and the other is lacewood veneer. Now, these two veneer species have different characteristics, so I use two different ways of applying a finish to them. First off, let me just say that I'm a big fan of rub-on polyurethane. I use it basically whenever it works because it's just so doggone easy. And easy is good. Why should everything have to be hard, right? That's why I chose it for the white birch cabinet. This veneer is tight grain and sands very smooth. It's the perfect surface to lay down a half dozen coats of rub-on poly and just call it a day. Sometimes polyurethane isn't the best choice though. For example, poly won't adhere well to some veneer species. I've personally had compatibility issues with waterfall babinga, for instance. And there are other species of wood that don't like to play nice with polyurethane as well, for whatever reason. For this lacewood veneer cabinet, I took a different approach. Lacewood often has an open grain structure, and that can result in a less than smooth surface if you were to just apply a clear finish to it. Some folks like to see and feel the grain texture in a wood surface, and I actually do too. It's a cool look, but not on a glossy finish so much, at least in my opinion. But I wanted a nice high gloss finish on this cabinet to make the grain really pop. And by far the best look for that involves getting the wood to a super smooth state before applying the shiny stuff on the top. That means I needed to do some grain filling to the veneer before applying the final gloss coats. You haven't heard of grain filling before? Yeah, don't feel bad. I hadn't either until my friend Kevin showed me how to do this several years back. It's not hard to do, but there are several steps to it. And as always, prep work is the most important part of any finishing project. I'll explain why I'm doing everything as I do it as we move along. Enough blabbing, let's get started. We'll start with a white birch cabinet, and here's what it looks like right before applying the poly. One of the most important steps you can take before applying any finish is getting the surface dust free. I always use compressed air to blow off any dust from the workpiece before I begin. This can get dust out of the tiny cracks and crevices that can find their way into the finish. I taped off the port area so the polyurethane could only be applied so far into the vent and to create a crisp cutoff line. I used two brands of polyurethane for this. For the first few coats I used Minwax rub-on polyurethane because it goes on super easy. It's very thin so it dries really fast. In fact, I can sometimes go over it twice during the same application. I applied 2 coats of the Minwax poly to get the surface sealed up, sanding lightly and carefully with 220 grit between coats. There isn't much poly on the surface with these first coats, and if you sand too much, you end up removing most of what you just applied. We just want to scuff the surface for good adhesion of the next coats, as well as remove any surface imperfections. After this second coat, the veneer is starting to look more smooth and even, but there's no real shine yet. That will start to happen quickly with the application of the next product, General Finishes Rub-On Polyurethane. It's thicker than the Minwax, but not as much as the brush-on polyurethane that you may be used to. I applied 2 coats, always sanding lightly between coats. The trick here is to apply it in a medium thickness, and once you get it on the surface, don't keep rubbing it. If you do, it can pool and get streaky looking if you keep messing with it. You just pick a side and get it covered, then leave it alone. I'm using a 6 to 8 inch square of old cotton t-shirt to apply all this poly with, by the way. After a few coats of the General Finishes poly, I usually switch back to the Minwax for one last thin coat to top things off. Why do this? Well, because the Minwax is so thin, it's easy to get a super smooth final coat. The trade-off is that it's thinner, but that's okay. We've already built some thickness with the previous coats of poly, and now I just want to get one last smooth coat to finish her up. Ah, look at that. I love putting a finish on a piece. It just makes it come alive. It's one of the most exciting elements of woodworking. Well, that and nearly cutting your finger off the table saw, but that's a different kind of exciting. Anyway, that's basically it for the Whyte birch cabinet. I just let it dry for a few days before installing everything, and I was pretty much good to go. I still have to paint the bottom yet, but we'll cover that process after we finish up with the lacewood cabinet. The first step in getting a nice rich color on this lacewood cabinet is to apply a liberal coat of boiled linseed oil on the surface of the veneer. I'm applying a good deal more than the wood can actually soak up. We really want it to soak in as much as possible. I let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes or so before wiping off the excess with a clean, lint-free rag. Depending on the type of wood you're applying it to, you may need more than one coat. But in this case, one coat seems to have done the job well enough. The color still remains vibrant. Now we wait. The boiled linseed oil is oil-based, obviously, and as such, it needs a few days to fully dry. I gave this piece 3 full days or so before moving on. Rags soaked in boiled linseed oil can get really hot and even spontaneously ignite, no joke. So toss those rags and brushes outside in the open air for a day or two before discarding in the trash. Next step, applying some Zinsser sealant to lock in all that beautiful visual goodness. The previous step with the boiled linseed oil, that's what gave me the deep, rich color that I wanted. This step doesn't add any color or zing to the finish. The only reason for applying this Zinsser sanding sealer is simply to seal that linseed oil in, so that there won't be any compatibility issues with the grain filler when we do the next step. Again, apply a uniform coat and then let it be. It can get streaky as well if you overwork it. The Zinsser is alcohol-based and dries pretty fast, so if you do this in the morning, for example, you can easily move on to the grain filling step by afternoon. I gave the cabinet a light sanding with 220 grit before applying a second coat of the Zinsser sealant. I sanded that with 220 grit as well. Now the veneer is fully sealed and we're ready to do some grain filling. Okay, on our lacewood veneer box we've got 2 coats of the Zinsser sealant. Now it's time to fill the grain with the Crystal-Lac grain filler. And for that, you just need a rag, a clean rag, but just a rag, and we're going to just rub it in. I've sanded this with 220 grit after the second coat of the sealer, and just rub this in. You're not creating a finish, all you're doing is trying to make sure that you have enough of it on there to get worked into all the little grain openings. This is not complicated or hard whatsoever. Just smush it in. It's sort of like the first step of waxing a car. You're just trying to get it on there and getting good coverage. That's it. As you can tell, I'm having trouble getting this stupid thing to stand up the way I want it to, but it's no problem if it leans over. It's not unstable. It's just getting on my nerves, that's all. Like I said, this stuff is basically like yogurt, and you just massage in a liberal amount to the surface and let it sit there for 10 to 15 minutes or so. After it's had time to get comfortable in all those grain nooks and crannies, it's time to remove the excess Crystal-Lac from the veneer. This really couldn't be easier. You just scrape it off. I'm using a 4-inch razor blade with the razor reversed, so just the non-sharpened metal edge is facing out. I'm pressing down with a good bit of force to make sure that none of the Crystal-Lac stays on the surface of the veneer. We do want it in the grain openings. We do not want it building up thickness on the surface. Once it's had a day or so to dry, I'll give it a sanding to remove any buildup of the Crystal-Lac on the surface. You should be able to feel any high spots with your fingers. Just give any you find a little extra love with the sandpaper, and done. The grain is now filled. All we have to do now is to hit the piece with one more coat of the Zinsser sanding sealer to ensure that the final finish coats of lacquer have good adhesion. I'm spraying the cabinet with a Rustoleum clear lacquer from a rattle can. Although I have no doubt that using a proper spray setup would be better, I seem to get pretty good results using this method. And like I said at the beginning, I like easy. Easy is good, as long as you're happy with the results. Keep in mind that this is sped up like 250% or so, but it's fairly easy to get excellent results with a rattle can. There are a few important things to remember when you're spraying lacquer from a can though. Make sure you keep this spray head the proper distance from the piece. The can will tell you what that distance is. Always keep the can moving when you're spraying, and you'll notice that when I'm spraying, the can is in motion before the spray stream begins to flow. But by far the most important thing to remember is wear a proper respirator. Lacquer is nasty stuff and it will mess with your nervous system. Do not breathe this stuff in at all. When I spray lacquer in my garage with my respirator on, I can't even tell that I'm spraying anything. That's how good these respirators are, and believe me, if you've never sprayed lacquer before, it is super smelly stuff. Pretty much the worst of all the stinky finishing products. Anyway, the lacquer dries really fast. It was a warm day in August when I sprayed this, and I was able to recoat every 15 minutes or so. Newly sprayed lacquer kind of melts right into the underlying coat, so you can respray in 20 minutes or 20 days. It really doesn't matter. Just keep the piece clean and keep spraying thin coats to build up some depth, and in an hour and a half or so, you'll have a pretty nice looking cabinet. I gave the lacquer as well as the polyurethane on the birch cabinet a few days to dry, and now I'm ready to take care of the bottoms of both of these cabinets. I always use Rustoleum Painter's Touch to cover stuff like this, panels that you really never see. Unlike most paints, this stuff covers MDF just fine, even that hard to deal with end grain. That's no problem for this stuff. Plus, it dries really fast. I used a chip brush here, but you could use a little roller or foam brush. Heck, even a rag would be okay. If you get a little of the paint on the finished sides, just wet a rag like I'm doing here and wipe it off. Easy, right? I applied one coat, waited an hour or so, and I was ready for final assembly. We're almost ready to put this thing together. First, I need to get the nickel drawer pulls ready to become subwoofer cabinet feet. I used thread lock to secure the supplied screws all the way into the drawer pull. I used a screwdriver to snug it up fairly tight. Then I used a Dremel tool with a cutoff wheel to remove all but about 1/2 inch of the screw. To install them on the cabinet, I mixed up some 5-minute epoxy, covered the exposed threads on the screw I just cut off, and inserted into the cabinet bottom, giving a little tap to make sure they are fully seated. I made up a lead to connect the terminal cup to the driver. I used 16 gauge speaker wire for this, crimping quick connect terminals onto the ends of the wires. The driver and terminal cup use different spade connector sizes, so I laid everything out on my workbench to keep things straight. Before installing the driver, I added a bit of polyfill inside the cabinet to quiet down any reflections a bit. Around a volleyball size amount roughly. I'm not trying to make the cabinet appear larger or anything like that. I just want to stifle any stray sound waves bouncing around in there. I pushed most of it in the top portion of the cabinet, past the brace, to keep it from falling and coming in contact with the rear of the driver. The heart of this subwoofer is the Peerless SLS PA30 945 5¼ inch driver. It's a mean little beast, and it can make more bass than you would ever think something this small would be able to. For the price, around $37, it's a bargain. No, it won't do 20 Hz, but it'll play in the 40 Hz pool all day long, even dipping its toes into the deep 30 Hz part of the pool when you ask it to. Well, let's get these two subwoofers put together so we can have a final look and spend a few minutes testing them out. I should note that the Peerless driver comes with a nice foam gasket pre-installed, so all we have to do is set it in place, feed the leads through the terminal cup opening, and tighten it down. This is where my previous work of pre-drilling all the holes is going to pay off. This thing goes together like a kit now. and all I have to do is install all the parts. No drilling and no possible buggering up of the finish or getting wood chips inside the cabinet from drilling out holes. I like to use the drill driver to get the screws most of the way in, and then use a screwdriver by hand to snug them up. Now I connect the leads coming from the driver to the terminal cup and screw that in as well. Hey, look at the terminal cup screws all oriented the same way. I know what you're thinking, but you know what? OCD my behind. Look, that's just good speaker building there. Alright, looks like we are done. Well, you heard the man. These two subwoofers are done. These subs will ultimately be used as the 0.1 in the small 2.1 table radio setup. Here's a sneak peek at what that radio will probably end up looking like. Maybe. Keep your eyes open for that video coming soon. And by soon, I mean as soon as I can. I do have a full-time job. Anyway, I think it's time for a demo. In these clips, I'm powering the sub with a Dayton Audio APA 150 sub-amp bridged, along with my Bantam's micro speaker system. No, it didn't shake the walls, but it's a 5-inch subwoofer essentially. And for some perspective, in that far shot, the camera was a good 25 feet away. Well, after messing with these subs for a few weeks, it seems that they're capable of some pretty decent output. I did hear some vent noise on the sweeps down low. A lot of vent noise, actually. But in normal music situations, I don't really hear it. So I think this design is one that's worth putting out there for anyone who wants to duplicate it. I'll leave links below to the Parts Express Tech Talk write-up that I did with dimensions and such. Before I sign off, I wanted to say that I don't profess to be an expert woodworker or wood finisher, although I have been doing this pretty seriously for over a decade. The techniques I demonstrated in this video are what works for me, and some of it I learned from others. As I said, the whole grain filling process, I had never even heard of that 5 years ago. But I learned how to do it because thankfully others were willing to teach. And that's the whole point of the videos that I make. I'm here hopefully to help some folks who haven't done some of this stuff to get a few rungs up on the ladder and have some success building their own audio equipment. This is an extraordinarily fun hobby for me, and if you're watching this, I hope for you too. So if you enjoyed this or any of my other videos, please leave a comment and let me know what you thought of it. Well, that wraps up part 3 of this series, and that's it for today. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye now.
Whyte.